"You'll regret this, Frank," she hissed, the words slithering out between gritted teeth as the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists. "I'll destroy you." It was a hollow sound, a final, impotent threat from a queen whose cardboard castle had just been washed away in a flood of her own making. I just stood there, watching the flashing blue and red lights paint her furious face in alternating strokes of panic and disbelief. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. My work was already done. It all started, as these things so often do, with something small and beautiful. It started with my wife's apple trees. My name is Frank. I'm a structural engineer, a man who spends his days analyzing stress points, load-bearing capacities, and the slow, insidious creep of decay in concrete and steel. I understand foundations. I understand that the most catastrophic collapses often begin with a single, imperceptible crack. For the past year, since my wife Maria passed, my own foundation had felt riddled with them. The one thing holding me together, the one solid piece of ground I had left, was the little orchard she had planted in our backyard. It wasn't much, just 5 dwarf apple trees she'd babied from saplings. They were her pride and joy, a splash of life against the beige-on-beige monotony of our suburban neighborhood, the meadows, a name that promised rolling green hills and delivered tightly packed houses governed by an iron-fisted homeowners association. Maria had loved those trees. Tending to them felt like continuing a conversation with her, my hands in the same soil she had turned, my face shaded by the same leaves that had sheltered hers. The meadows was, on the surface, idyllic. Manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and a quiet that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. The source of that tension, the architect of our community's silent anxiety, was Carol. She was the president of the HOA, a title she wore like a military sash. She was a woman in her mid-50s with a haircut you could set your watch by and eyes that scanned every property for infractions with the predatory focus of a hawk. She walked the neighborhood every morning, clipboard in hand, a self-appointed sentinel of suburban perfection. My first real interaction with her, beyond a curt nod, happened on a Tuesday. I was out back, pruning a branch on one of the apple trees, when her voice cut through the air, sharp and brittle. "Frank," she called. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Her voice had the unique quality of making a first name sound like an accusation. I sighed and turned. She was standing on the edge of the common area that bordered my property, a thin strip of grass separating my fence from the next row of houses. Her arms were crossed, her lips a thin, disapproving line. "Carol," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Your trees," she said, gesturing with her chin. "They're becoming a problem." I looked at the trees, then back at her. "A problem? How so?" "Fruit fall," she said, as if it were a diagnosed disease. "A few of your apples have fallen over the fence into the common area. It attracts pests. It's unsightly. It's a violation." I glanced at the ground behind my fence. I saw 2, maybe 3 small apples lying in the grass. "It's 2 apples, Carol. I can pick them up right now." "That's not the point," she snapped, her voice tightening. "The point is the potential for a recurring violation. Those trees are a public nuisance. According to Section C, Paragraph 4 of the bylaws, any feature of a private property that negatively impacts the aesthetic or hygienic standards of the community can be deemed a nuisance." I knew the bylaws. Maria and I had read them cover to cover before we bought the house, laughing at some of the more absurd rules. I never imagined they'd be weaponized over a piece of fruit. "They're just apple trees, Carol. They were here when you were elected president. They've never been a problem before." "Well, I am making them a problem now," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You have 30 days to have them professionally removed. Failure to comply will result in daily fines." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. It wasn't just annoyance, it was a deep, protective anger. These were Maria's trees. Removing them would feel like digging up a piece of her. It was unthinkable. "No," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I'm not removing the trees." A flicker of something, shock, maybe even delight at the prospect of a fight, crossed her face. "Excuse me. You heard me. They aren't a nuisance, they don't violate any rules in a meaningful way, and I'm not cutting them down." I turned back to my pruning, a clear dismissal. "You will regret this, Frank," she said, her voice low and menacing. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I heard her stomp away, the furious crunch of her shoes on the gravel path. I looked at the apple trees, their leaves rustling in the breeze. She was right about one thing. I had no idea who I was dealing with. But I was about to find out that she had no idea who she was dealing with, either. An engineer doesn't just look at a structure, he looks for its breaking point. And Carol, I suspected, was a structure built on a very unstable foundation. The first fine arrived 3 days later. A crisp white envelope in my perfectly regulation-compliant mailbox. $100 for failure to abate a nuisance. I scanned the letter. It was professionally printed, citing the same bogus bylaw she'd thrown at me. I filed it away in a new folder I labeled Carol. The next day, another envelope. Another $100. And the day after that. It was clear she was serious. This wasn't a warning, it was a war of attrition. She thought she could bleed me out, that I'd eventually surrender to the financial pressure. She underestimated my stubbornness, and more importantly, she underestimated my sentimentality. Every fine notice felt like an insult to Maria's memory, and with each one, my resolve hardened like quicksetting concrete. I responded, of course. I wrote a calm, formal letter to the HOA board, quoting the actual bylaws which stated that mature landscaping was exempt from aesthetic reviews unless it posed a direct safety hazard. I pointed out that 2 apples on the ground did not constitute a safety hazard. I included photos. I sent it via certified mail. The response was silence. The fines, however, continued to arrive with metronomic regularity. Then, Carol escalated. She moved from bureaucratic warfare to public shaming. A new notice appeared on the community bulletin board near the mailboxes. It was titled, Community Standards Alert. It didn't mention my name, but it didn't need to. It has come to the board's attention, it read, that certain residents are failing to maintain their property in a manner that respects their neighbors. Rotting fruit from unkempt trees can attract rodents, wasps, and other vermin, posing a health risk to our children and pets. We urge all residents to be considerate and deal with such problems promptly. My house was the only one on the block with fruit trees. It was a targeted, public attack designed to turn my neighbors against me. A few of them started giving me wide berth, offering tight, uncomfortable smiles instead of their usual friendly waves. They were afraid of being caught in the crossfire. Carol's power wasn't just in the bylaws, it was in the fear she cultivated. The whole neighborhood was a house of cards, and no one wanted to be the one to breathe too hard. I felt a surge of frustration, hot and sharp. This woman was twisting reality, painting me as some kind of public menace over a handful of apples. It was absurd. It was infuriating. But I knew losing my temper was exactly what she wanted. She wanted me to yell, to make a scene, to prove her right. I was an engineer. I dealt in facts and figures, not hysterics. I would not give her the satisfaction. Instead, I went to the common area every single morning and evening. I scoured the grass on my hands and knees, ensuring not a single leaf or apple from my trees was on HOA property. I documented it with time-stamped photos. I was building a case file, a meticulous record of her harassment and my compliance. It was how my mind worked. Collect data, analyze the variables, identify the stress points. The turning point came about 2 weeks into this Cold War. It was a Saturday. My son, Leo, who was 15, had a friend over. They were in the backyard, tossing a football around. I was in the kitchen, making them lunch, when I heard Carol's voice, sharp as broken glass, drift through the open window. You boys need to be careful. One of you could trip on that rotten fruit and break your neck. Your father clearly doesn't care about your safety. I froze, my hand clutching a knife. I walked to the back door and saw her standing there, glaring at my son and his friend. Leo looked mortified, his face flushed with embarrassment. We're fine, Mistress Carol, he mumbled, looking at the ground. It's not fine, she snapped. This yard is a disgrace and a danger. That was it. That was the line. You could fine me, you could slander me, but you did not get to harass my son. You did not get to humiliate him in front of his friends. The cool, detached engineer in my head went silent, and the grieving, protective father took over. I walked out onto the patio, my face a calm mask that concealed a tectonic shift inside me. The phase of reasonable response was over. The phase of strategic demolition had just begun. "Carol," I said, my voice dangerously level. "You will not speak to my son that way ever again. You are on my property. Leave. Now." She was taken aback by my tone. She was used to me being placid, responding with letters. She opened her mouth to retort, but the look in my eyes must have told her she had pushed too far. She gave a little scoff, turned on her heel, and marched off. Leo wouldn't look at me. "Dad, it's fine," he said, though his voice was shaky. "No, it's not fine, Leo. But I'll handle it." That night, after Leo was asleep, I sat at my desk and opened the Carol folder. The stack of fines, the community notice, my photos, it was a chronicle of petty tyranny. But it wasn't enough. Responding to her attacks was a losing game. It was time to stop playing defense. It was time to start my own investigation. My engineering mind kicked in, methodical and cold. Every structure has a weakness. Carol presented herself as an unshakable pillar of the community, but she was just a person. People have flaws, secrets, vulnerabilities. I just needed to find them. My first move was practical. The next morning, I went to an electronics store and bought 4 high-resolution, weatherproof security cameras with night vision. I spent the afternoon installing them, positioning them discreetly under the eaves of my house. One covered the front yard and street. One covered the side yard. And 2 were focused on my backyard, specifically on Maria's apple trees and the fence line bordering the common area. If she so much as breathed on my property again, I would have it in crystal clear 4K. Next, I went online. I pulled up the HOA's website. It was a simple, amateurish affair, mostly managed by Carol herself. But it had one crucial section: public documents. I downloaded every meeting minute, every budget report, and every financial statement for the past 5 years. I spent the next few nights poring over them, a highlighter and a calculator by my side. It was tedious work, a sea of numbers and bureaucratic jargon. But engineers are trained to see patterns in chaos. For the first 2 years of documents, everything seemed more or less in order. The landscaping contracts were with a well-known local company. The maintenance fees were reasonable. Then, 3 years ago, coinciding with Carol's election as president, things started to change. A new company appeared on the expense reports, Evergreen Solutions. Their invoices were astronomical. They were supposedly responsible for common area horticultural management and seasonal aesthetic upkeep. The descriptions were vague, the costs exorbitant. A quick search for Evergreen Solutions in our state's business registry turned up nothing. A web search yielded only a handful of generic, unrelated businesses in other states. There was no local address, no phone number, no digital footprint whatsoever. It was a ghost. A very expensive ghost. My heart started beating a little faster. This was it. This was a crack in the foundation. She wasn't just a power-hungry bully, there was money involved. And where there's suspicious money, there's usually a crime. I kept digging. The payments to Evergreen Solutions were always signed off by 2 board members, Carol, the president, and a man named Arthur Weems, the treasurer. I remembered Arthur from the one HOA meeting I'd attended. He was a small, nervous man who looked like he was perpetually apologizing for taking up space. He seemed like the type to be easily intimidated. He was my next target. But before I could make a move on Arthur, Carol made one on me. It was the move that sealed her fate. I came home from work on a Thursday evening. As I pulled into the driveway, I felt a sense of dread. Something was wrong. The air smelled strange, a bitter, chemical scent that was completely out of place. I walked around to the backyard, and my stomach dropped to my feet. Maria's trees were dying. The leaves, which had been a vibrant green just that morning, were now yellowed and curling at the edges, as if they'd been scorched. A sickly, oily sheen coated some of the branches. The ground around their bases was dark and damp, despite the lack of rain. She had poisoned them. The grief hit me first, a raw, physical blow that took my breath away. It was a violation far deeper than fines or nasty notes. She had come onto my property, into my sanctuary, and attacked the last living thing Maria had given me. She hadn't just sprayed my trees, she had desecrated a memory. The grief was quickly consumed by a cold, crystalline rage. It was the calmest, most focused anger I had ever felt in my life. There were no more rules. There was no more benefit of the doubt. This was not a dispute anymore. This was a hunt. I immediately went inside and pulled up the footage from the backyard cameras. I rewound to the previous night. And there it was. At 2:13 a.m., a figure slipped across the common area. It was Carol. She was wearing dark clothes and a hoodie, but the camera caught a clear shot of her face as she looked around. She carried a large, unmarked pump sprayer. I watched, my knuckles white, as she systematically walked from tree to tree, dousing the trunks, the branches, the very soil they grew in. She was thorough. Malicious. When she was done, she gave the trees one last look of profound satisfaction before disappearing back into the darkness. Section I saved the video file to 3 separate hard drives and a cloud server. I put on gloves and a mask, went outside, and took soil samples from the base of each tree. I collected a few of the poisoned leaves. I placed everything in sealed bags, labeling them meticulously. This was the evidence. This was the weapon. Now, I had to build the machine to wield it. My wife, Maria, had been the county health inspector for over 20 years. Her work wasn't just a job, it was a calling. She believed in rules, in regulations, in the systems designed to keep people safe. She knew every health code, every environmental statute, every loophole, and every enforcement mechanism in the county's legal arsenal. And while she was gone, her legacy, and her network, remained. I called her old deputy, a man named George, who was now the head of the department. I explained the situation, the harassment, and the poisoning of my trees. His voice, usually jovial, turned grim. "Frank, I am so sorry," he said. "What that woman did isn't just an HOA violation. Depending on what she used, it could be a serious environmental crime. Bring me the soil samples. We'll run them through the lab, off the books for now. Let's see what we're dealing with." I had my first ally. The gears were starting to turn. My plan began to form, a multi-phase project with a clear objective, not just to stop Carol, but to dismantle her entire power structure in a way that was both legally airtight and poetically just. She used the bylaws as her shield and sword, so I would use a bigger, stronger set of rules, city ordinances, county health codes, state laws, to crush her. The first phase was to set a new trap. The trees were a crime of passion for her, a personal vendetta. I needed to bait her into another act of overreach, something less emotional and more calculated, something that would further expose her tyrannical nature to the other residents. I decided to build a vegetable garden. A large one. With raised beds, a compost bin, the whole 9 yards. It was perfectly legal according to the bylaws, provided I submitted the plans for review by the Architectural Control Committee, a committee of 3 people, chaired by Carol. It was the perfect lure. The thought of me creating another nuisance, another source of organic untidiness in her perfect plastic world, would be irresistible to her. I spent a weekend drawing up the plans, making them as detailed and professional as any blueprint I'd submit for a multi-million-dollar building. I specified the materials, untreated cedar, the dimensions, within all setback requirements, and the soil composition. I even included a drainage plan. I submitted the packet to the ACC, officially starting the clock. As I waited, I focused on Arthur Weems, the treasurer. I needed to get him to talk. A direct confrontation would scare him off. I needed a different approach. I looked up his address. He lived 3 streets over. I started adjusting my morning walk to go past his house. He was a creature of habit. Every morning at 7:15, he'd be out front, meticulously trimming his hedges into perfect, soulless rectangles. He always looked anxious, as if the hedges might suddenly rebel. On the 3rd day, I happened to be walking by as he was working. "Morning, Arthur," I said, keeping my voice friendly and casual. He jumped, startled. "Oh. Frank. Good morning." He wouldn't meet my eye. "Those are some sharp hedges," I said. "You've got a real eye for detail." "I respect that. I'm an engineer. Precision is everything in my line of work." He gave a weak smile. "Just trying to keep things tidy." "I get it," I said, leaning against the fence. It's important. Especially when you're responsible for things. Like you, with the HOA's finances. That's a lot of responsibility. A lot of numbers to keep straight. I saw a flicker of panic in his eyes. He started trimming a perfectly flat section of hedge with frantic energy. Must be tough, working with Carol, I continued, my tone sympathetic. She seems very particular. She's dedicated, Arthur mumbled, the words sounding rehearsed. Dedicated, I echoed. Is that what they call it? I was looking at the budget online. I noticed this company, Evergreen Solutions. They charge a fortune. I couldn't find anything about them. You must have their contact info, for the records. I was thinking of getting some landscaping work done myself. His hands froze. The shears trembled slightly. I don't handle the vendor contracts directly. Carol does. Ah, I said, letting the silence hang in the air. So she just gives you the invoices and you cut the checks. Based on her word alone. Arthur swallowed hard. He looked up and down the street, as if expecting Carol to materialize from thin air. I have to go, he said abruptly, gathering his tools. I'm late for something. He practically fled into his house. It was a start. I had planted a seed of doubt, a kernel of fear. He knew the finances were dirty. He just needed a push, and the assurance that he wouldn't be the one taking the fall. A week later, I got a letter back from the ACC. My garden plan was rejected. The reason cited was potential for pest attraction and aesthetic disharmony with the community's established character. It was signed by all 3 members, but the language was pure Carol. This was even better than I'd hoped. She wasn't just obstructing, she was doing it officially, creating a paper trail of her unreasonable behavior. The next HOA meeting was in 2 days. It was time for the first reveal. Time to let Carol know that I knew. The HOA meetings were held in the sterile, beige community center. About 20 people showed up, the usual mix of retirees with too much time on their hands and a few younger couples who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Carol sat at the head of a long folding table, flanked by a stone-faced secretary and a visibly sweating Arthur Weems. She ran the meeting with ruthless efficiency, shutting down any questions she deemed irrelevant. When she got to the new business section, I raised my hand. She looked at me, her expression a mixture of annoyance and triumph. Yes, Frank. I stood up. I'd like to discuss the recent increase in vandalism in our neighborhood, I said, my voice calm and carrying through the room. A murmur went through the crowd. Carol's eyes narrowed. I'm not aware of any widespread vandalism. Perhaps not widespread, I said. But certainly significant. My property was targeted. Specifically, the 5 apple trees in my backyard were deliberately poisoned with a powerful herbicide. The room went dead silent. Everyone stared at me. Arthur Weems looked like he was about to faint. That's a very serious accusation, Carol said, her voice tight. Do you have any proof? As a matter of fact, I do, I said, letting my eyes lock onto hers. I now have a comprehensive security system. I have high-definition video evidence of the individual who trespassed onto my property in the middle of the night and poisoned my trees. I didn't name her. I didn't have to. The color drained from her face, then came rushing back in a furious, mottled red. Her composure, the one thing she prized above all else, cracked like cheap concrete. How dare you, she shrieked, slamming her hand on the table. The water pitcher jumped. You are slandering me. You installed illegal cameras to spy on your neighbors. I'll have you sued for everything you own. Her reaction was more incriminating than any confession. Her denial was too quick, too specific. She had immediately made it about herself. The other residents exchanged uneasy glances. They had all been on the receiving end of Carol's temper, but they had never seen her completely lose control like this in public. Her mask of dignified authority had not just slipped, it had shattered on the floor. I haven't accused anyone by name, Carol, I said softly, letting her own hysteria condemn her. I simply stated I have evidence of a crime. My cameras are perfectly legal and are positioned to view my own property. If you feel personally accused, perhaps you have a reason for that. This is harassment, she yelled, pointing a trembling finger at me. You have been a problem since you moved in. This meeting is over. She banged a gavel that seemed to appear out of nowhere. She stormed out of the room, followed by the secretary. Arthur Weems lingered for a moment, his eyes wide with terror, before scurrying after them. The trap had sprung. I hadn't shown the video, I hadn't presented the financial records. I had simply revealed that the board was no longer flat. I had introduced a new piece to the game, and it had sent the queen into a panic. I knew what would come next. A cornered animal doesn't reason, it lashes out. I went home to prepare for the onslaught. The retaliation was swifter and more vicious than I could have imagined. Carol wasn't just trying to win an HOA dispute anymore, she was trying to destroy my life. It started with a visit from the city code enforcement officer. He had an anonymous complaint about an unpermitted structure in my backyard, the frame for one of the raised beds I had started building before the ACC rejection. I showed him my submitted plans and the rejection letter. He was a reasonable man and rolled his eyes. Looks like you've got an HOA issue, not a city one, he said, and left. Next, she went after my job. A letter, written on HOA letterhead and signed by Carol, was sent to the senior partners at my engineering firm. It claimed I was an unstable and aggressive individual who was a danger to the community, and that my erratic behavior called my professional judgment into question. My boss, a man I'd worked with for 20 years, called me into his office. He slid the letter across the desk to me. I'm assuming this is garbage, he said. Complete and utter garbage, I confirmed. Good, he said, and ripped the letter in half. But watch your back, Frank. This is a nasty piece of work. I was grateful for his trust, but the attempt left me shaken. She was trying to ruin my reputation, to threaten my livelihood. But her most despicable attack was yet to come. It was a Wednesday afternoon. Leo was home from school. We were in the kitchen when the doorbell rang. I opened it to find two people, a man and a woman, dressed in professional attire. They held up badges. Mr. Frank, the woman asked. We're from Child Protective Services. We've received an anonymous report expressing concern for your son's welfare. May we come in? The world tilted on its axis. My blood ran cold. Of all the lines to cross, this was the one I never thought she would dare. She had weaponized my son. She had used the system designed to protect children to terrorize my family. I let them in, my mind racing. I was numb with fury, but I knew I had to stay calm. Any anger, any defensiveness, would look bad. Leo came into the hallway, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. It's okay, Leo, I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake in my chest. Why don't you go up to your room for a bit? He hesitated, then nodded and disappeared upstairs. The social workers were polite but firm. They explained the anonymous tip had alleged neglect, that the home was unsafe, and that I was emotionally unstable due to my wife's passing. It was a cocktail of cruel half-truths and outright lies, designed to inflict maximum pain. They inspected the house. They saw a clean, well-kept home. They looked in the fridge and saw it was full of food. They asked me questions for nearly an hour. I answered everything calmly and truthfully. Finally, they asked to speak with Leo alone. That was the hardest part. I sat in the living room, listening to the murmur of their voices from the kitchen, feeling utterly powerless. This woman, this petty tyrant, had brought this nightmare into my home. After 20 minutes, they came out with Leo. The woman gave me a small, reassuring smile. Mr. Frank, it's clear to us that this report was unfounded and malicious. Leo is a bright, well-cared-for young man, and you have a lovely home. We'll be closing the case. I'm sorry you had to go through this. After they left, Leo came and sat next to me on the sofa. He was trying to be brave, but I could see the hurt in his eyes. It was her, wasn't it? He asked quietly. Mistress Carol. I put my arm around him and pulled him close. Yes, son. It was her. Why does she hate us so much? Because she's a bully, and we're not afraid of her. And that makes her angry. I held him for a long time. The last vestiges of my restraint burned away. This was no longer about justice. It was about eradication. She wasn't just a nuisance, she was a cancer in our community, and I was going to cut her out. The gloves were off. The plan for demolition was now fully engaged. The next morning, I got a call from George at the county lab. "Frank, we got the results back from your soil sample," he said, his voice grim. "It's bad. She used a highly concentrated form of 2,4-dichlorophenoxyacetic acid, mixed with a glyphosate. It's a potent combination, often used for clearing industrial sites. It is absolutely not approved for residential use. In these concentrations, it's a hazardous substance. She didn't just poison your trees, she contaminated your property." He emailed me the official lab report. It was the final piece of physical evidence I needed. A banned chemical, applied recklessly. This elevated things from simple vandalism to a serious environmental and public health issue. Now it was time to turn up the pressure on Arthur Weems. I waited until Saturday afternoon, when I knew he'd be home. I walked to his house, carrying a thick file folder. I didn't knock. I saw him through the front window, watching television. I went around the side of his house to his electric meter and flipped the main breaker. His house went dark. A moment later, his front door opened, and he stepped out, looking confused. He saw me standing on his lawn. "Frank, what are you doing?" "We need to talk, Arthur," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. I held up the folder. "This is a copy of the HOA's financial statements for the last 3 years. And this," I pulled out a separate sheet, "is a detailed analysis of all payments made to a company called Evergreen Solutions. A company that doesn't exist." He turned pale. I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me, Arthur," I said, stepping closer. "I'm a structural engineer. I find weak points for a living. You, my friend, are a very weak point. You've been signing checks, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth, to a shell company. That's called fraud. It's a felony. You could go to prison for a very long time." He started to tremble. "It was Carol. It was all her idea." "I know," I said. "But you're the treasurer. You signed the checks. In the eyes of the law, you're just as guilty. You're an accomplice." He looked like he was going to collapse. "What do you want?" he whispered. "I want your cooperation," I said. "I'm giving you a choice. You can go down with her, or you can help me and I will make sure the district attorney knows you were a cooperative witness. I want the real bank statements. The ones that show where the money actually went. I want a signed affidavit detailing everything you know about this scheme. You have until tomorrow morning to decide." I turned and walked away, leaving him standing on his lawn in the silence of his powerless house. I didn't have to wait long. My phone rang less than an hour later. It was Arthur. He was crying. "I have everything," he sobbed. "The bank statements. The invoices. She made me keep a separate ledger. It's all there. The money went to an account owned by her brother-in-law." "I'll be there in 5 minutes," I said. I met him at a coffee shop miles from our neighborhood. He handed me a thick envelope, his hand shaking so badly he could barely let go. He looked like a man who had been carrying a mountain on his back and had just set it down. He told me everything. How Carol had come up with the scheme to funnel money out of the HOA reserves. How she'd intimidated him into signing off on it, threatening to ruin his career as an accountant if he refused. I now had a whistleblower and undeniable proof of a major crime. The next day was a Monday. I took the day off work. My first stop was the police station. I filed a formal report, laying out the entire case, the harassment, the vandalism, the contamination of my property, the false CPS report, and the financial fraud. I handed over the video, the lab report, and the documents from Arthur. The detective's eyes widened as he went through the file. "This is extensive," he said. "We'll be opening an investigation immediately." My second stop was the district attorney's office, where I provided them with a duplicate of the entire file. My third stop was the County Environmental Protection Division, where I handed over the lab report on the soil contamination. The gears of justice were now grinding, slow but powerful. All that was left was the public execution. I used another provision in the HOA bylaws that allowed a resident to call for a special meeting if they submitted a petition with signatures from 10% of the homeowners. I spent the evening going door to door. I didn't have to say much. Word of the CPS visit had gotten out. People were horrified. They were tired of living in fear of Carol. I got twice the number of signatures I needed in under 2 hours. I filed the petition the next morning. The special meeting was scheduled for Thursday night. The topic I listed on the notice was a presentation regarding gross financial mismanagement, criminal activity, and conduct endangering the welfare of the community by members of the board. The stage was set for the final showdown. Thursday night, the community center was packed. It was standing room only. Every resident who had ever received a fine, a warning, or a condescending glare from Carol was there. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. It felt less like an HOA meeting and more like a public tribunal. Carol and the board sat at the front table. She was trying to project an air of calm authority, but I could see the panic in her eyes. She had no idea what was coming, but she knew it was going to be bad. Arthur Weems was conspicuously absent. I had set up a projector and a screen. When the meeting was called to order, I was the first on the agenda. I walked to the front of the room, holding a remote for the slideshow I had prepared. "Good evening," I began, my voice steady. "Thank you all for coming. I have called this meeting to present you with some information that I believe is critical to the health, safety, and financial solvency of our community." I clicked the remote. The first slide was a picture of Maria's apple trees in full bloom, taken the previous spring. As many of you know, my late wife planted these trees. They were important to my family. Click. The next slide was a photo of the trees after they were poisoned, their leaves withered and brown. 2 weeks ago, they were destroyed. Click. The screen was now filled with a crystal-clear image from my security camera. It was a still frame of Carol, her face illuminated, holding the chemical sprayer. A collective gasp went through the room. "This is Carol, our HOA president, trespassing on my property at 2 in the morning to poison those trees." "That's a lie." "It's doctored," she shrieked, jumping to her feet. "Is it?" I said calmly, and I hit the play button. The entire room watched in stunned silence as the video played out, showing her meticulous, hateful act from beginning to end. When it finished, no one said a word. They just stared at her. "The substance she used," I continued, clicking to the next slide, which showed the county lab report, was a hazardous, non-residential herbicide. "She contaminated my soil and created a potential health risk." Click. The next slide was titled, "Evergreen Solutions, a Financial Analysis." For the next 10 minutes, I walked the community through the fraud. I showed the inflated invoices. I showed the payments from the HOA bank account. I showed the corresponding statements from Arthur, proving the money was funneled directly to an account owned by Carol's brother-in-law. Every transaction, every date, every signature was there in black and white. "Over the past 3 years," I said, my voice ringing with authority, "Carol has embezzled over $200,000 of our HOA funds. Money that was supposed to be for maintaining our community, for our property values, for our families." The room erupted. People were shouting, yelling at Carol, who stood frozen, her face a mask of disbelief. And when I began to uncover this, I said, my voice dropping, "She retaliated. She filed false complaints with the city. She tried to get me fired from my job. And she made a false, anonymous report to Child Protective Services, bringing them into my home to harass my son." That was the final blow. The anger in the room turned to pure revulsion. People were looking at her as if she were a monster. And at that moment, Carol completely and utterly broke. The carefully constructed facade of the respectable community leader crumbled into dust, revealing the shrieking, entitled tyrant beneath. "You deserved it," she screamed, her voice raw and unhinged. Her eyes were wild. "All of you. You're all ungrateful. I made this neighborhood what it is. Your disgusting trees were ruining everything. And that money. That money was owed to me. For all my hard work. For dealing with you pathetic, whiny people." Her ranting confession hung in the shocked silence. And into that silence walked 2 uniformed police officers. The detective I had spoken to was with them. They walked straight up to the front table. "Carol," the detective said calmly. "You are under arrest for embezzlement, vandalism, criminal mischief, and filing a false report." As they cuffed her, her rage turned to me. Her face was contorted with a hatred so pure it was almost breathtaking. "You'll regret this, Frank," she hissed, the words slithering out between gritted teeth as the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists. "I'll destroy you." It was a hollow sound, a final, impotent threat from a queen whose cardboard castle had just been washed away in a flood of her own making. I just stood there and watched them lead her away. The flashing lights of the patrol car painted the stunned faces of my neighbors as they processed the downfall of their oppressor. The aftermath was like the quiet that follows a storm. The community exhaled a collective sigh of relief. An interim board was appointed, and they immediately began the process of undoing Carol's reign of terror. Dozens of her most ridiculous rules were abolished overnight. The fine against me was expunged, and the HOA's lawyer sent me a formal, written apology. Arthur Weems, in exchange for his testimony, received probation and community service. Carol's fate was far more severe. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable evidence and the testimony of half the neighborhood, she was convicted on multiple felony counts. She was sentenced to 5 years in state prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA. Her house was sold at auction to cover her legal fees and the restitution payments. She lost everything: her power, her money, her home, her freedom. The community began to heal. People started talking to each other again. Block parties were organized. Kids played in the common areas without fear of being reprimanded for laughing too loudly. The oppressive quiet was replaced by the gentle, happy hum of a neighborhood at peace. A few weeks after the sentencing, I was in the backyard with Leo. The dead apple trees had been professionally removed by a hazmat team, paid for by the HOA's insurance. They had to remove several inches of topsoil as well, to ensure the contamination was gone completely. Leo and I stood looking at the 5 empty patches of earth. "It's sad," he said, "that they're gone." "It is," I agreed. "But memories aren't in things, Leo. They're in us." I put my hand on his shoulder. "And besides, foundations can be rebuilt. Stronger this time." The next weekend, we went to a nursery. We bought 5 new saplings, 2 apple, 1 pear, 1 peach, and 1 cherry. We spent the entire day together, digging, planting, and mulching, laying the foundation for a new orchard. As we finished, I stood back and looked at our work. The new trees were small and fragile, but they were full of promise. My new vegetable garden was thriving nearby, a testament to the fact that sometimes you have to dig in and fight for your little patch of earth. I had never wanted this fight. I was a quiet man who just wanted to be left alone to tend my garden and grieve for my wife. But Carol had forced my hand. She had mistaken my patience for weakness, my quiet for cowardice. She didn't understand that a structural engineer knows that the most immense pressures can be brought to bear by applying force in exactly the right spot. She was a bully who ran into a man who understood leverage. Looking out at my peaceful backyard, at my son watering the new trees, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't felt in a long time. The fight wasn't just about the trees. It was about defending my home, my family, and the memory of the woman I loved. It was about ensuring that the peace she had built for us would not be torn down by the petty whims of a tyrant. And in the quiet of that evening, I finally felt at home again. The foundation was solid once more.